and it's Dr. Stewart Stehlin. He's an emeritus professor of history at NYU, whose field of specialization is the diplomatic history of Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries and the development of modern European state in the 19th and 20th centuries. He's the author of Weimar and the Vatican, 1919 to 1933, German-Vatican diplomatic relations in the interwar years. That's available on Amazon, and I'll have a link to it down below. He also wrote a paper entitled Germany and a Proposed Vatican State of 1915 and 1917. And I discovered that paper while I was researching our recent video here on this channel regarding urban legend about was Pope Pius Saint Pope Pius X murdered. You had talked a little bit about during the Vatican, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, the First Vatican Council, how there was a rebellion in Rome. I never asked you the first time I interviewed, what was the genesis of that, besides just general dissatisfaction?
What, you mean the genesis of the council?
No, the citizens' uprising during the council.
Yeah, well, I mean, this has been a standing thing that many of the people in the city did not well, first of all, they felt the taxes were too high. They felt there was inefficiency and things of this sort, which of course reflects the attitude that the church, especially at this time, has two sides to it. There is the temporal and the spiritual. And of course, many of the citizens in the city did not feel that they were being governed correctly.
Was there any ideology behind it other than that things weren't right? Any liberalism involved in there, or just general dissatisfaction?
Well, I mean, this anywhere goes through with the attitude that the liberals would obviously be watching what the liberals have done in other countries, in England, particularly in France, from 1789 and 1848, and of course endowed with the idea that they too have a right to a parliament, to a vote, which of course you did. I mean, the papal states were run autocratically, and therefore their feeling again was they didn't have a say, hey, look at what the others are having, and we don't have that, and that was part of it. The administration of Pius IX was pretty tight-fisted. I don't mean only monetarily, financially, but also just in terms of how things are done. It's from the top down. Hear this, that's the way it's going to be run. You have to remember too that there are many people coming into Rome, tourism just beginning, but still there, but dignitaries and their entourages. People talked, people compared to what was happening in other countries, and their feeling was the Romans, with their proud heritage, and reading about the Roman Republic of the classical age, we're not getting a fair deal.
Can you tell me a little bit about the unification of Italy? Well, it was in 1800s. It was divided into several states.
Correct. Let's put it this way. In the north, you have part of the territory run by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the Austrians run it. Then for a period of time, again, from the Middle Ages, you have little teeny states along the way, and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, for example, always had a Habsburg, that is an Austrian, again, running the show. Basically, the only comparatively well-run state at the time that was in Italian hands was Piedmont, up in the north, capital Turin. In the middle of the country was the Papal State. And then in the south, you have what they call the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. Sicily and the southern part, they called it the Two Sicilies. So when unification, the conversation, I mean, obviously, unification was in the air during the whole 1800s. I mean, again, look what happened in France and so forth, and were a series of little states were run by foreigners. We need to be unified. And of course, this same type of thinking you get in Germany at the time. So the question then was, who's going to unite? And very prominently, one of the big things was the Pope, obviously. I mean, he's a big name, he's known in the world. And of course, the opposite thinking was, yes, but he wears two hats, spiritual and temporal. And then even when that was suggested among some of the cardinals and even the Pope saying, yes, but I have children on both sides, and I can't run the show as such and maintain proper roles in the spiritual world. Then the southern state of the Two Sicilies, most people acknowledge it wasn't wrong. It was just sleepy south, and they didn't do anything. They weren't, so therefore they weren't obviously ones. They were too, negative comments, too stupid to run, but I mean, they were just too lazy and they weren't aggressive. And you can't talk to the Habsburgs because they're foreigners. So the obvious one was Piedmont, the House of Savoy that ran that.
When the Vatican was considered as a possibility, were overtures made by the Vatican itself to the various governments or people pushing unification? It was just considered by itself.
Suggested, we don't want it.
Okay.
And it was just among, what should we say, nationalists thinking over, well, who's going to do it? Then the idea is, well, I mean, the Pope, it's in the center of the country to start off with. They have Rome, the historical center of the area. Well, why not ask the Pope? And that was part of the idea. A negative right there, if you were sitting among nationalists talking, it would be, oh yeah, but he's too conservative and he's too autocratic, and would he even consider a legislature? You know, this. And then of course the Pope himself saying yes, but how can I do that when I've got these other things to do and so forth? So it became the most advanced, most progressive, it seemed to be Piedmont. And they weren't hesitant. I mean, they were thinking about it because Piedmont expanded in the 50s and the 60s from the smaller state, and there were several wars with Napoleon III backing Piedmont against the Austrians.
How much was liberalism tied into it?
Well, sure. I mean, most of the liberals were in favor of nationalism. I mean, not only Italy, but Germany, the same thing. And nationalism in these two countries would mean a legislature and the ideas of freedom of the usual things that we take for granted: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and things of this sort. And the idea in most of them would be, well, just for example, if we take Italy, if you were a liberal, you would be against the foreigners, which means you're also a nationalist. You're against the influence of the Austrians in the north. They should get out. They're not Italians. At the same time, the government of the Austrian was again autocratic, and as a result, this made the wedding, you could almost say, between liberalism and nationalism in this period. Both of them had like interests, and so therefore it played a role.
So historically, when we talk about liberalism, it's nothing like what we think about today, like the Democrats versus Republicans. Actually, liberalism would be more, both Democrats and Republicans are liberals by definition.
Liberal is liberal. It's not dividing in. I mean, again, we have to get away from the American or the present day mindset where in most countries, the basic so-called liberal principles are in practice. So then you start working down to individual things that you want more of or introduce that hasn't been. But at this time, it's just let's get the basics there. So they haven't divided into subdivisions yet.
And liberalism, because of the freedom of religion and really freedom of speech, all these items was tied to anti-clericalism.
Not all the time, but the objection was that the church per se owned an awful lot of property, for example. And as a result, that should be, as a liberal, that should be stopped, changed, altered. And we have the examples for the liberals or for anyone to go back and think about. I mean, during the Napoleonic Empire, or right before, they had a lot of the property of the church in Germany was when the Confederation of the Rhine, the reformation of the Rhineland by Napoleon III, a lot of the property of the church was taken away. You could use the church for services, but the lands, the farms, the produce, as well as the financial benefits would go to the secular state, not the church. The secularization, and of course, a lot of this when the aristocrats, well, first of all, using Germany as an example, but Italy is the same. Many of the prelates owned property or were noble, and hence connected with the aristocratic nobility rightist approach. So naturally, the liberals would be anti-clerical in that sense. And the same thing in Italy. I mean, many of the prelates, most of them were, of course, coming from noble families. And of course, as if you were one that believed in equality and the like, you would be opposed to it. So that part of anti-clericalism, and it gets worse with the unification of Italy. They have a platform in the legislature to push for more restrictions on church influence in the lay state. And this you find in other countries. I mean, France had it in the end of the 19th century as well. Germany, of course, again, the National Liberal Party, take note of the title, Nationals, Liberals, and the Socialists were not happy with granting or more privileges to the church.
So how was Freemasonry and liberalism, how were they related?
Because you don't hear much about Freemasonry in terms of the material. I mean, the Pope spoke against a lot of it because the Masonry of the 18th and 19th century, of course, was very heavily influenced by agnosticism and super-rationalism. And of course, this would be opposed to faith, and many of the statements would be from either side, almost like in a battle. The clerics warning against it, being godless, being in terms of destruction of the family and the rights of the structure of society. The liberals would obviously adhere many times, not always, but I mean to Freemasonry, to say it's rational, it's based upon thinking patterns, it's not taking things from somebody else and so forth. So there was that antagonism was there because many people joined it for what should we say, social advancement. I mean, for example, Mozart was a Catholic. Mozart was a Mason, but Mozart was still a Catholic and a Mason. So there's a whole series of, you can't say anybody that's a Mason is going to be anti-church, but on the other hand, the official statements from the higher-ups in the Mason in the lodges would be portraying the church as suppressive in its nature and not allowing people to think. The church in its position would be opposing it, saying it's godless, it's going to destroy society, it is opposed to religion, and so forth. So, and that doesn't hurt either by the fact that the Masons incorporated rituals in their services. And of course, people will see, look, that's like a religion, you see, hence against. And the idea, the secretiveness of it.
I'll be back again soon with the next part of my interview with Dr. Stehlin, but in the meantime, please pray for the church.